Hello, my friends, and welcome to the very first episode of The Great Unbecoming with a guest. Okay, he's already getting excited. Calm down, Mike. You're not the first episode, okay? But you are the first episode with a guest, and I'm very excited about it. Before I introduce my guest, I just want to give a really big shout out to my buddy Nick, who just completed the 10-week shame-free journey. Nick texted me and he says, Eric, you've been so welcoming and determined from the start. You've made me feel excited about the program and the work we'd be doing together. With the connection of other people who relate to self-worth and healing and the tools that I've learned, this program has made me feel alive to look within and grow. And I'll always be in connection with the program and with people that I've met along the way. So it's more like an investment than a limited exercise. I'm grateful. I'm very grateful to have come across you on Instagram and all the people that I've met and the things that I've learned from these experiences. Thank you, Nick. I love you, man. So grateful to have worked with you, and keep up the work. Now, I can't wait to introduce my first guest. This is Mr. Mike Maeshiro. Mike is a gay consultant and coach. He's the author and founder of Numa, a spiritual intelligence organization equipping people and affirming the queer community, deconstructing harmful ideology, and honing spiritual discernment. And also, he's a really cool dude, and he's a good friend that I've gotten to know in the last, year or so, Mike?
Yeah,
something like that.
Over a year, yeah.
Yeah. And you're also, you also have your own podcast, Confessions of a Reformer, which I just listened to the very first episode this morning. How does that make you feel?
Season 3 or the very first episode ever?
The very first episode ever.
Oh, that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, good. I told y'all before we started, I was like, Mike, I'm kind of nervous. I don't know why, y'all, but like when I do Instagram lives, I don't get nervous. But there's something about recording this, knowing that it's not public yet, that for some reason feels, probably just because it's new. And I said, I'm really good when I feel nervous of like purging that discomfort onto other people, like I just did with Mike.
Nice.
How does that make you feel, Mike?
It makes me feel, I feel nervous.
Good.
Mission accomplished.
Good. But what's interesting, listening to your first episode, I'm like, oh my God, we have so much in common. I wanted my first episode just to be solo. And you should see if you're on YouTube right now, you can see his face. He really looks very uncomfortable. And so to listen to yours and know that you did your first one solo was just really kind of funny. And also, I just found out today that your dad is also a photographer.
I didn't know your dad was a photographer.
Yeah, my parents owned Photography by Feltus, and they started it the year I was born. My sister was 5. My dad had just lost his other job. They just bought a house. We actually moved into the house that I grew up in the day that I was born. So the stakes were high, and it obviously worked. 37 years later, they just retired last winter and just moved to Florida. So they are very happy and retired now.
Nice. That's awesome.
Is your dad still work?
He does. He's not a photographer anymore. He was doing that for so long. And then the company he was working with changed ownership and whatever. And then he decided he was done doing that. So he still works. I think he works at a, he works at a retail type store in Oregon now.
Cool. We need to exchange some little Eric and little Mike photos from what our dads took, because I'm sure there are plenty.
Yes, indeed.
That'll be for episode 2.
Right.
Or our episode 2. So I've been on your podcast a few times. There was no question in my mind who I wanted to be my first guest. I love talking to you. I think we have such good conversations. And y'all, Mike is the kind of person that he has such childlike wonder. He views everything with such a curious mind, and also asks such curious questions, and also has such conviction and discernment for what he believes in. So in the spirit of Unbecoming, Mike, I kind of want to dig into your journey. You and I already talked about this. We've had such good conversations about what the word Christian means to us, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to have a relationship with God, and more importantly, how that relationship and how that word Christian has sort of evolved for us over the years. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of where you were maybe before the podcast or even before you came out. And then I'll, as I do so wonderfully, rudely interrupt, and we'll just go from there.
Perfect. That sounds great. Eric, thanks for having me be here. I'm honored to be your first guest. That's like so cool.
You're so used to saying thanks for being here because I'm usually your guest. Yeah.
Wait, I'm not hosting. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Does it feel different to be the guest versus the host?
No, I've done a few interviews on other people's podcasts. So it feels a little bit normal. Apparently not in this context.
Again, I'm really good at making people feel uncomfortable.
So I have like this long dramatic story, but the short version of before I came out, I was very involved at a church called Bethel Church in Redding, California. I wore many hats in that environment, and the place changed my life. I'm very glad to have gone there for a lot of reasons. And then there was also a lot of harm that I experienced being there, a lot of which I didn't acknowledge as harm at the time because I didn't know any better. So I worked on staff in the events department there, helped run conferences for 6 years. And then as I was in that position, I took on other roles. So I started leading mission trips. They have a giant ministry school. So students come from literally all over the world to come to this ministry school. So I took students on mission trips every year. I took interns from the third year program and mentored them. I became an instructor in the school and taught discerning of spirits. And the class was, it just grew quite a bit while I was doing that. And then I started traveling and speaking, conference speaking and preaching at churches and things while I was there too.
Yeah. And it was really fun listening to your first episode of the podcast because I feel like a lot has listen, in like 2 or 3 years from now, if you say, hey, go back and listen to your first episode, I'll probably feel the same way. But I feel like a lot has changed for you over the years. Can you, let me ask you, here's one question. I wrote a couple notes from the first episode. You talk in the first episode about,
I had no idea we're going to be talking about my first episode of my podcast on this conversation.
That was intentional. I didn't want to tell you.
Right.
In the first episode, no, nothing bad though. In the first episode, you talk about preaching the gospel. You use those words. How has preaching the gospel changed or evolved from where you were then to where you are now? Or what does that mean to you?
I hate you, Eric.
Do you really? Are you upset that I didn't tell you about this first?
I'm uncomfortable. I'm actually uncomfortable. It has changed. Firstly, I would say I don't preach the gospel anymore. And I don't know if that's entirely true, but I definitely don't have any interest in proselytizing anybody. I don't want to try and like coerce someone to believe in any kind of, dynamic with God that they don't align with, that just because I have an idea about how this should look doesn't mean that someone else needs to adopt it for themselves. I did not think that when I recorded my first podcast episode, right? I used to think, and I don't want to just fault Bethel for this because it's not just Bethel, like evangelicalism is this way, right? There's this supremacist approach. We know better. How we do it, how we understand it is actually supreme. It's better than what other people know. So we're going to actually export what we have and who we are and our beliefs and practices to other environments and impose that on them so that they can change and become like us, was literally the mentality. We did it through a culture of honor. So we never went anywhere we weren't invited. We didn't impose on spaces that weren't asking for it.
They're like vampires.
Sure.
You have to be invited before you enter their space.
We needed the invitation, but once we got it,
That's all. I like how you said sure without even knowing the reference. You're like, yeah.
Well, when there's so many different forms of vampire lore, I thought you were saying like the other form of this, of people just going and proselytizing despite the invitation, like vampiric, just coming and trying to take from people.
No. Oh no, vampires are very, very polite. They're gentle. I was going to say gentlemen, but they're gentle persons, gentle bats. They have to be invited, but then it's all over.
Totally.
But in the name of Christ for you.
Yeah, totally. So that was the mentality back then. And now I think back on that and I'm like, man, that is so cringy and embarrassing and terrible. Coming out as a gay person, especially publicly, especially from Christian professional ministry, like there are some severe lessons to be learned through that transition. And I got to become very aware of how narrow-minded and ignorant I was in a lot of ways. And so when it comes to preaching the gospel, that I would not treat the gospel that way. I would not administer it to someone else in that way. So now I have such respect and value for other people's journeys and the autonomy that they should have in exploring and understanding what they believe to be true, what they align with, what makes sense for them. And, you know, instead of imposing some kind of arbitrary standard on everybody saying they should all at least believe these things, which I think is terrible. I don't think that's God's heart at all. I actually want to like hold the space that people get to be where they are and they get to pursue what they want. And, you know, like they're the ones who get to make that call. And none of us out here get to judge or shame or coerce them otherwise. That shouldn't be like that, especially if we're trying to follow what Christians would call the love of Christ. Like it wouldn't function like that.
Now, I love that. And, you know, we're joking about making you feel uncomfortable, but the reality is that our stories are very different timelines, but very similar. You know, and in the intro that I read that you gave me, you come out and you say that you're a gay coach, right? So how has your queerness sort of impacted your view on Christ, on evangelism, on your mission here on earth as a Christian?
So many ways. Well, I think one of the big, like, eye-opening, concerning lessons I had to learn was, you know, this whole idea of privilege. I did not understand that where I was. Like, privilege was a politicized term that didn't apply to people at Bethel. That was for like victims and intersectionality and people who want to like roll over and blame other people for why their lives are hard. And
I bet they hate the word woke, don't they?
Yeah, well, they use it as like a derogatory term to just like dismiss a whole group of people in school of thought, you know? Yeah.
Right. Because empathy, who needs it, you know?
Ew. Yeah. So
empathy makes me feel uncomfortable, and I would rather avoid my discomfort by purging that onto other people. But continue.
Yeah. So I had to learn pretty quickly about the privilege I was enjoying. And part of it was coming from like me lying, right? Like being dishonest, not just with myself, but then obviously consequently to everyone else. So I was benefiting from the system I was part of and the ideology by staying in the closet. And eventually got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. I was like, I can't do this. It was like some deep spiritual underpinnings that were nudging me to ruining my career. But
can you talk about that? Can we pause?
Sure.
What was that like for you? What was the turning point for you?
I watched.
And this is only what, like a year ago?
It's probably about 2.5 years ago now.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I came out publicly a year ago, but
got it.
This happened like a year and a half before that. I watched a documentary called Miss Americana by Taylor Swift on Netflix. And she,
gay.
Yeah, right. And she had a moment in there where she was like basically preaching on gay rights and like advocacy for the queer community. And so I had a spiritual reaction. I was experiencing like the onset of intense conviction and I didn't understand. I was like, why is this happening? Like what? I was genuinely surprised at the depth of impact it was having on me. And I was like concerned a little bit. I was like, what is going on here? But I would use the word discerning enough to recognize whatever happened right now is substantial. I don't know what to do with it yet. I don't have enough information to draw any particular conclusions. So I'm going to just hold it. And I left it alone. And 2 weeks later, I had another experience. This time it had nothing to do with Taylor Swift, but I was like processing. And then the story of Peter going up on the roof in Acts 10 dropped into, back then I would have said dropped into my spirit, right out of nowhere. So I pulled it up on my phone, read that story, and the same spiritual conviction happened in that moment that I felt with Taylor Swift. And I was like, is God trying to tell me that being gay is okay, right? It's like Peter seeing stuff come down on a sheet from heaven that Jewish people aren't allowed to eat, and God tells him to eat. And Peter says, no, I've never done anything unclean like this, right? And God's like, don't call anything unclean, I've made clean, right? And then 3 weeks later, I get another experience. I'm in the woods, like processing a ton of pain that had nothing to do with my sexuality that I was aware of. And then again, like this story of Jesus confronting and rebuking the teachers of the law. You heap rules and requirements on the people without lifting a finger to help them. You prevent people from entering the kingdom while you yourselves refuse to enter. And that was the breaking point for me. Like it was a successive, like a series of these experiences. And by that third moment, like I realized that this was, in the language I would have used back then, this was the Holy Spirit. Like God was talking to me and I hadn't heard them like this in a long time.
Wow.
And so I was like, I don't want to live without the voice of God in my life. Like, and I'd done it for 4 years up to that point. I was like at the top of my game, right? Like my career, my ministry, my brand, whatever was like,
The stakes were high.
Yeah. And yet, like, I was doing all this with, like, I was using God to do this. I wasn't doing it because of God, you know?
Yeah.
And I didn't want to have to face that. So this moment just kind of confronted me, and it was all like hinging on my sexuality. Because I had experiences with God probably 8 other times the previous 14 years of my life, of the voice of God speaking to me about my sexuality and affirming and defending the fact that I was a gay person. And I just couldn't accept that. And I didn't want to talk to anyone about it because I knew I would be demonized. Right. So anyway, this was the breaking point. And so to like look at it, I knew if I look at this, I don't know where it's going to take me. I don't know what the end result is going to be. I just know I'm going to lose a lot. I know that will happen. That is certain. I knew the depth and like the weight of what this was. And so it was terrifying. And so it took me like, obviously like days of processing to even like find language for this. And then once I realized this was happening, I started talking to some close people in my life and just started putting English to it. Like, this is happening. I had this experience. I had these experiences. I'm having these feelings, these thoughts, whatever. That was the beginning of the end.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that started about 2.5 years ago.
Yeah. It was right in the middle of the pandemic, 2020.
You know, I think that there is a false idea. I don't know about you. I had a false idea that, you know, once I come out of the closet, everything will be good. Life will be easy, right? And life is not easy when you come out. Life absolutely is more authentic, though. Everything you experience in your life when you come out is more authentic. The relationship you have with yourself, you don't have that heavy burden of trying to put a mask on that doesn't fit you. And also your relationships with other people. There are people that stay in your life that love you even more because they're so proud of you. And there are other people that choose to walk away. You know, I always say that you share a piece of yourself with other people, AKA your sexuality, and their response tells you everything you need to know about them. And for you, the stakes were really high because of how public you were, where you came from, the people that you worked with. How did this affect, you mentioned Numa. First of all, tell us a little more about Numa. And then I want to hear how you coming out kind of affected your mission and also the relationships with people you were working with.
Okay, I'm trying to keep this short. So I took interns from Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, and every year the interns from the previous year like wanted to stay on my team and just keep being a part of what we were doing. So I created space for them to still be part of things. I got a new batch of interns that I would prioritize for that year, but there was peripheral engagement and activities, whatever the previous years could be part of. And the more we got down this road, the more momentum and structure started getting built around that, to the point where I was like, we probably need to create some kind of brand or, you know, I don't know, something that can give us a collective identity, because whatever this is, I would like to at least give it like a name. And especially because we were trying to communicate with the outside world. And it was like, what do I tell people about? It's not just me. It's not just Mike Maeshiro. It's like, I've got a crew of people around me. So that's where Numa kind of got birthed out of organically. Numa is the Greek word for spirit, breath, you know? So that's where Numa came from. And we were primarily focused on spiritual intelligence and discernment at the time, mostly because my audience was supernatural Christians, right? People who were like obsessed with Bethel. So it was right up their alley. And there wasn't a ton of discernment content being put out there at that time. I don't know if there is now. But I thought this is so important to me. It was such a big part of my experience being at that environment. So I just started trying to find language for how do you navigate these things. And people were very hungry for the concepts and verbiage that I was providing. So Numa was primarily focused on creating content and serving people in that arena. And so I came out to my team at some point in that process, and it was really awkward and painful. I mean, there were a lot of tears. The Sunday morning, I remember that I prepared and like just sat them all down. I was like, you guys, and I told them my story. And at some point in that, I was like, I'm gay and I'm embracing this by myself. And I believe that God is the one compelling me to do this. And that was obviously jarring for a lot of them. And I knew that was the case. I knew we were all anti-gay, you know, because we went to Bethel, and Bethel was like very loud about that. And
Hmm.
But you also, you know, you learn later, like, it's not just Bethel. Like, all these people came to Bethel because there were these underpinning, like, overlapping values, and anti-gay rhetoric was part of what made this place safe and approvable by their. Anyway.
Yeah.
So it was really like, it was a painful conversation, but what was more painful for me was like the following weeks of having.
Can I pause you? Because I think that you just said something really valuable. And I think that a lot of listeners are going to relate to this. You, in part, if I hear you correctly, were attracted to a place like Bethel because even before you came out, you knew that you probably said you quote unquote struggle with homosexual tendencies, right? Like it probably wasn't a part of your identity. That's what I used to say. Did you say that? Yeah.
Yeah, I said like I struggled being attracted to guys. Yeah.
Right. Because you can't say I'm gay. And so, because then that sounds so much more permanent, right? You can't change it. So, you were probably attracted to a place like Bethel because you knew that they would kind of keep you in the closet. They'd help to keep you in line.
I actually thought they might change me. Coming to Bethel might be part of like my transformation, right?
Sure.
They preach, you know, and ex-gay ideas and share testimonies of people who stopped being gay. So, you know, that wasn't the reason I went there, but that, yeah,
it was a perk.
Yeah.
Right. No, I felt the same way. I mean, I was Catholic through 8th grade. And then after 8th grade, I went to a public school, but I decided to go to an evangelical church. A lot of people ask me why. And, you know, in part, there were a lot of very charismatic people there. I wanted friends. There were more people that were excited about God there. I felt because that's just the energy that I felt. Yeah. And I was the kind of person that, I guess I still am. If I'm going to do something, I want to do it 100%. So I wanted to go all in. And of course, also, I felt like being gay was wrong. And I genuinely believed if I leaned deeper into this message that God can change me, completely missing the fact that I am made in the image and likeness of God. I thought too that, you know, sort of like a conditional loving God, right? If then, right? If I do this, then I will be straight. Mm-hmm. If I act this way, if I go to this church, if I go to Sunday school, if I also go, you know, on Wednesday nights, if I do all of these things, then I will be straight. So it sounds to me like you found a little comfort in this place, thinking that this is the school of like wizardry and sorcery is the way I've heard Bethel described. And it's kind of the way you're describing it too. So like you can like have some sort of a spell and then not be gay anymore.
Yeah. Some lightning moment that could happen in the atmosphere. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if you ever said it like that while you're there, but that's kind of like the wish. Yeah.
Right.
At least, yeah, for sure.
And then that didn't happen.
No. So like what actually happened was the opposite. I just kept hearing this voice in my life, in the deepest part of me, affirming the fact that I was gay. And it was like the opposite of like what I thought was going to happen on this road. So eventually I'm telling my team, and it was actually the weeks leading, like after I came out to them, that started like exposing a deeper pain. Like my team predominantly treated me like I never said anything. They avoided it. They pretended like I didn't just confess something deep and meaningful and like very vulnerable and intimate. And
did anyone?
A couple of them, yeah. People were closer to me. You know, some of the people on my team were closer to me. So they, you know, we talked about it and whatever. But it was like my team was like 36 people. At that point, I had whittled it down to like 22 people. But, you know, the people around, like, they just didn't, I thought they'd have questions. I thought they'd get upset. I thought they'd want to like, you know, wrestle out some stuff. And I welcomed any and all of that. And that's not what happened. It was avoidance. It was silence. It was like, yeah, they're happy to hug me and tell me they love me and whatever. How was the weather? What'd you eat yesterday? And I just told them I was gay like 2 weeks ago, and it's just hadn't come up. And eventually 3 weeks later, I like sat them all down. I'm like, hey, this is not okay. I feel the opposite of loved by you guys in this experience.
Wow.
And I want to speak on behalf of queer people. Like, this is not Christian. This is not Christ-like.
Wow.
The way I'm experiencing you in this experience is terrible. And I'm shocked. And I'm genuinely like disappointed. You guys know me. You've known me for years. You've been following me for a long time. I don't understand how you're okay with treating me like this. This makes no sense to me. And that was really difficult for them to hear. And then like the offense started coming up, and they started getting really, you know, and I think the straight privilege started showing itself, and the bad theology, and they didn't know how to process. And I think it's a lot. I understand, like, if your leader in that context, when you're just groomed to be submissive and whatever, and your leader is giving you something that you believe is sinful or deceived, or, you know, and you feel threatened and whatever, that's a lot to have to figure out. And I understood that. I just hoped that there would be like some transparency in the process. If I'm going to expose myself to this degree, would they at least be honest? I was, so anyway, that was really painful to experience. And the more we went down this road, the more painful it became for me. So eventually I was like, I need to freeze what we're doing. Let's just put all of the Numa thing on hold for now, you guys. Let's take a month or 2 months or whatever. And eventually I just like announced, like, I'm not going to unfreeze this. Let's be done. And I just kind of like released them all from being a part of what I was doing anymore. I just didn't want to do it. I didn't want to experience that. I didn't want to be subjected to it. It just felt dehumanizing, and they were equipped to care for me. And it was such a vulnerable process. So that was like it wasn't an end, but it was definitely like a reiteration, right? Like Numa had to evolve. And so people actually did come from Reading to Nashville with me, and Numa lived on, and Numa's still a thing, right? But the people that I was running this with in Reading, I had to shed a lot of them because they couldn't make it. And I did everything I could to try and explain all this in English, but it wasn't that simple, and I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. I understand like that process is a lot. It's jarring to ask of them at that age, at that point in their careers or their, ministry journeys. And they didn't ask for it. So I told them up front, like, you don't need to be part of this. I just want to give you permission to opt out. If you need to get off the train, that's totally fine. The thing is, they didn't get off, but they treated me like it didn't happen. And it wasn't. And so, yeah, that was really painful. And that was just my team. And so then I started having conversations with leaders at Bethel, right? That I, who either oversaw what I was doing or were adjacent to me or whatever. And those conversations were all civil, mostly, they were polite, but I mean, nobody listened to me. It was all like, okay, so you need to say, here's why you're wrong. Here's what needs to change, whatever.
You just didn't pray hard enough. There's something you didn't do. Yeah.
I don't believe the Bible. I don't trust God. Yeah, totally. Sure. Yeah. Totally. And so I remember the moment I was like, I'm done. In terms of trying to like walk this out with leaders at Bethel, I was talking to the person who I was probably the most involved with on the leadership level. He had the most oversight over my process there. He told me, Mike, God loves gay people. Gay people, will go to heaven or whatever. It's the moment you pursue a relationship with a guy that you're not following Jesus.
Oh, God.
And when he said that,
I had so much hope for him until he said that. There's nothing wrong with you being that way. Just don't ever enjoy it. Just don't ever do anything about it. You're just called to be celibate.
And I had told him my story and some deep things that I had experienced with God. And then he told me that, which in other words is like, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
What you just told me didn't happen. What you just told me is invalid, is irrelevant, right? Which is not cool. Like, that's not okay. Theology and doctrine is supreme. Your journey, your experience, subjected to that. And I don't believe that anymore. I remember that world, and I think it's really dehumanizing to treat people that way and to like treat dogma like that. So
let me ask you a question real quick. Let's say roles were reversed. Let's say someone else were the founder. Let's say I was the founder of Numa and you worked for me. Yep. Let's say this was a couple years before you came out, so maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I came and I said, hey, I'm gay. And I came out to you. What do you think? How do you think you would have handled that situation?
I think it's really tough to answer that because I was gay, right? So, I mean, people.
It's a different world. It's a different situation because you were way more afraid because you were experienced. You probably would have felt seen in a scary way.
Yes, that's true too. But also, like, I think because I was gay and I knew that and had like this distant hope that could somehow change, it did also make me sympathetic to other gay people who would make choices I didn't make. I had people come out to me in the process of me staying in the closet at Bethel. And I was, in my recollection, I was always gentle with them and like empathetic and permissive, right? Like I did advise them like, hey, don't keep it in, like talk to people, process this, keep people in your process with you. I didn't really ever have solutions. I had advice on how to like continue moving forward in our environment because of how I had been treated.
So to continue to sustain. Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is or the solution.
You didn't know. You hadn't done it yet.
Here's how you behave. Here's how you can still be here and not go crazy, not shame yourself into a hole, right? So if a boss of mine, if I was that guy and a boss came out to me and told me what I told them, I probably would have been like, whoa. Like I'm thinking about my boss that I worked for at Bethel. If she had told me what I told my team, I would have been like, I would have asked a ton of questions. I would have been so thankful that she was willing to be honest with me about that and trust me with that. I would have been so fascinated. And I think it would have opened me up. And I think I would have been positively impacted by that. And it probably would have changed my theology. Not right away, but I would have done the work. I wouldn't have let it go because of my relationship with her. I would have like hunted it down, but that's like the way I am. I don't think everyone's like that. Right. But like when something I think is true is challenged and threatened by substantial evidence, I can't leave that alone. I'm going to hunt that until I find the answer. Right. So
wow.
I think that I would have been compelled, honestly. And I can't know that, but I think that I would have. Yeah. And I had some people on my team respond to me that way. Like they came with me, they changed their minds, they became allies and are affirming now because of my journey. Right. And so that did happen with some people.
And this is the thing, y'all, is like, we are not here to have all of the answers. We are here to explore. We are here to find the answers. And you even talk about this in your first podcast. You talk about how you want to be an explorer. You want to be on the edge of what you know, constantly pushing the boundaries, which is so beautiful and ironic for you to talk about in the first episode, seeing where you were then, seeing what you've explored along the way with your podcast and in your life, and seeing where you are now. But we're not there yet. We're not to where you are yet. We'll get there.
Right.
We're in the thick of it still.
Yeah. I should listen to that podcast episode again.
It's good stuff. Because I know you, I can tell you're a little different.
God, I hope so.
Yeah. But not just by what you say, but just like, because I know you and your voice, like I can tell there's like a little, like you're enclosed. I don't know how to describe it.
In the episode?
Yeah.
Can't imagine
it's like you're in the closet or something. Yeah. It's not like you had anything going on in your life. Okay, so some people came with you. Again, all your relationships became authentic. You saw who was loving you unconditionally from the start versus whose love had a but after the words "I love you." Those people kind of stayed away. I always say that those who value your values will gravitate towards you. It looks like some people followed you. How has Numa in your work changed since coming out?
The language we use has changed. That's a big...
Yes, I noted that in the first episode.
Yeah, because the language back then was so colonizing, you know, it had so many undertones and so much condition attached to it. And it was so coercive and binary, right? Like it just was not accommodating to any kind of diversity or giving permission for flex and humanity. Like, anyway, so language has changed quite a bit. We deconstructed in the last year and a half. Like we had to, we couldn't just become queer affirming. That was our first initiative, but because of what dismantled in that process, we had to look at some other stuff. Wow. None of these tenets stand alone, right? They're not islands, they're interconnected. And so when you pull at one thing, something else unravels and you just have to it just keeps going.
It's exhausting.
Yeah. So we did, we went as far as we could. And then, you know, I mean, we're not done, but we definitely have taken a break in some of it. But our theology legitimately on a fundamental level changed in that process. And I found a bunch of other voices and work outside of the Bethel bubble, outside of the evangelical fundamentalist restrictive orthodoxy. And we found an expression and tradition within Christianity that's so much more expansive and permissive. And also I gave permission to people on my team and myself to not have to be Christian at the end of this. Like you don't have to end up anywhere in particular. You don't have to have a certain conclusion about your faith or spirituality or about God. Like I want all of us to be free and have permission to find what's true for what we understand and can actually authentically align with. And be honest about that. And I think that's what any environment should be like, especially a religious one, like especially one that claims to follow Jesus. If you're going to be Christ-like, at the very least, people should have permission to be honest, and their authenticity should be like celebrated and honored, not demonized and bullied. So anyway, that journey happened. And so now work-wise, we less cater to right-wing evangelical Bethel people, and are equitably, in my opinion, prioritizing the queer community and then people recovering from religious trauma and like baggage and church hurt and, you know, harm that came from being raised in that kind of space. There's so much cultural baggage that we have to sort through and undo. And then theologically, there's so many beliefs that got embedded in us at such a young age that need to be
That who embedded in us?
Beliefs? What?
That who embedded in us?
I don't think
Did you say that? Did you say that God embedded in us? Is that
no,
what
I
you
said there's so many beliefs that got embedded.
Oh, I was like, let's be careful. I don't think God embedded.
No, God came
conditionally
and
loving beliefs. Yeah,
shoved the eternal conscious onto us.
Yeah.
No, that God,
Let me ask you a question. How has, for you in your personal life, how has your view? Do you identify as Christian?
Loosely, yes.
Okay, so you loosely identify as Christian. You identified as Christian probably staunchly before you came out.
Oh, staunchly, yeah.
So how has your evolution, what's that evolutionary process been? And what's your relationship with the word Christian now versus then?
Okay, then when I said I was a Christian, it meant I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. I repented for the sin person I was and invited Jesus to come into my life and make me a non-sinner. And so that meant I was going to heaven and not hell. It also meant that I had the mind of Christ, which means I knew things and understood things in a way that people who were lost or in the world could not know. Right? I had the Spirit. And you say it now, I'm like, I believed this.
No, I did too.
Anyway, yeah, it's just, so it means that I believe Jesus was coming back and was going to establish, a whole different world, and the kingdom of heaven was going to show up in a different way here. I was already starting to deconstruct some of that stuff while I was still at Bethel. But anyway, Christian, like it was my job, my mandate to change other people's minds and get them to understand that Jesus was the only way. Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life, and no one could get to the Father except through Jesus. They were sinful beings and they needed a savior, right? Jesus was murdered by God so that God wouldn't murder us instead, right? Like,
sacrifice. We need a sacrifice.
Yeah. So that was, I believed all that. I don't believe that anymore. So I use the word Christian. I identify as a Christian because I think it's more of a cultural and a traditional affiliation, which isn't irrelevant. That matters. But I also find so much beauty and value. I don't know if I can't in the message of Christ, right? Like what Jesus brought to the table and this Christ consciousness that he pointed to and taught and exposed within people. I've been so impacted by the teachings of Jesus and the work of Jesus and the advocacy that Jesus brought to the table that I needed, that I didn't even know I needed while I was still so closeted, right? Anyway, so I have a value for who Jesus was, and I deeply believe in the reality of God, of the divine. I don't need people to call God the same thing I call them. I don't need them to say the same name or write. Yeah, I don't need them to relate to God the way I do. I just am convinced, which is awkward for me. I confessed this to my team this last week, hey, you guys, through the deconstruction process, I know atheist beliefs were kind of coming up for some of us about just considering what does this look like? And I respect atheists. I think that they're at least honest. But through my process, if I'm being honest about my journey, I'm not an atheist. And it's not because I can't be. I was willing for several months there to be an atheist. I'm okay, I'm open to this. Is that possible? Is it possible God's not real? We made this up. We are using the word and idea of God hyperbolically for something else that's actually going on. I was genuinely rolling around in that for a while. And some of that is plausible. I'm I can see that. But through my experiences and whatever, it doesn't sit with me. It's not true for me. I can't, God is real in my opinion and experience. Right. So, in that sense, I'm Christians do talk about and believe in some deity. I think that whatever if they are having authentic experiences there, I think I'm having similar ones, and I honor that and I value it and I relate to that. So in those ways, I think there's a lot of overlap that feels significant enough. And also there's not some board of directors that gets to tell me I'm not a Christian, that gets to define and gatekeep what Christian even means. That doesn't exist. They don't. Yeah. People who've rejected me don't get to bully me and tell me I'm not a Christian. They can say it all they want. It doesn't make it true. They don't have, there are lots of things Christians do that I can say that makes you not a Christian. That doesn't make them not a Christian. But anyway, so that also I think was liberating for me, and realizing I don't get to be bullied right out of this. People don't get to tell me I'm not Asian just because I'm white passing. I am half Japanese. That's true. Just because I don't look Japanese enough for Japanese people doesn't mean I'm not Japanese, right? Just because I don't look white enough for white people doesn't mean I'm not white. I'm both. Sorry, I know it's inconvenient, but anyway, in the same way, Christians don't get to tell me I'm not a Christian. So I don't know. I could just keep going, but that's
my favorite response when someone tells me that you can't be a gay Christian is simply, I believe that you believe that, because it lets them know that they have been heard. I've heard you. I believe you believe that, but this is not up for debate. My goodness in this world is not up for debate. Oh, I'm just trying to save you because I love you. Then you need a new definition of the word love. That's what I believe. But I believe you believe that God's love is conditional. And if that makes you sleep better at night, fine. For me, it's the biggest thing of like when I walk away from anyone, if I feel closed off and less than and not enough, that's not someone or something that I want in my life. So when I don't say I walk away from God, but when I sit with this idea of Christianity, if I feel less than, closed off, that's not God. God is unconditional, radical, inclusive love. It's infinite love. Human beings, we cannot comprehend what infinity means. And I think that's where we meet our own faith, which is not certainty, but rather sitting in our own discomfort of what we do not know and choosing love over fear anyway. So it's scary. Deconstructing is scary. We don't have to have all the answers, but I'm going to follow what makes me feel open and honest and good and infinite like Jesus.
Love that.
You bring up a great verse, which I love, which is Jesus saying, all may enter the kingdom of heaven through me. The reason I love this verse is because it is the meaning of it has drastically changed for me over the years. Just like you, before I used to think that this meant, oh, if I don't believe in Jesus, then I'm going to hell. And I just absolutely think that is the laziest, most dangerous interpretation of that verse, because all it does is help people to avoid accountability for their own assholery. Hey, I think you're going to hell. Hey, I don't think you should have the same rights as I do. But it's not me. It's written in this book, and I can do whatever I want. Yes, of course I've sinned, but that's okay because I believe this thing, and that is my ticket to heaven. I believe that when Jesus said, you may enter the kingdom of heaven through me, that this man was saying, act like me. Do good things like me. Choose love over fear like me. Flip the table like me. Push back on politics. Push back on religion. Push back on people in power and be like me. Therefore, together, we can create the kingdom of heaven here on earth. But I think that that's scary. And I think that when Jesus said, come follow me, I think what Jesus was saying, Mike, was raise your consciousness to my level. That is a scary, uncomfortable thought. People didn't want to raise their consciousness to Jesus's level. So instead, they pushed Jesus above us, glorified him, dehumanized him, and then crucified him. And I think we completely miss the point of love when we push Jesus above us. The more I view Jesus as a teacher, a prophet, a human being, the more I feel seen by Jesus, the more I relate to Jesus. And there was a night where during my own deconstruction process where I broke down, Mike, and I was sobbing. And I remember feeling this presence of God telling me, thank you for not giving up on me. And the image I had in my head was an image of me. And I'm not saying that I'm God. I am saying that I can act like Christ through my actions. It's so much more relatable than we realize. And in crying and sobbing in that moment, I couldn't help but think of Jesus the night before he was murdered. Sobbing, saying, God, I don't want to do this. If Jesus, who some proclaim to be the Son of God, can ask, God, do I have to do this? And to question, to me, that gives me permission to be a human. That allows me to ask tough questions as well. I mean, Jesus was an explorer. I don't think Jesus had all the answers. And he was scared. He was a human. I feel like that gives me an invitation to love myself, the world around me, and my higher power so much more than this archaic, dangerous, lazy belief that that Jesus is a ticket, your meal ticket to get into heaven, and therefore you can do whatever the heck you want here on earth as long as you believe this. I think that's lazy and it's absolutely false.
Agreed.
Anyway, thanks for joining us, y'all.
Totally.
So you mentioned exploring, and I want to talk about what you're exploring now, right? If we're always learning, sort of in conclusion, / ... to be continued, where is your head at now? What are you currently being challenged with? And how are you, either unlearning what doesn't serve you or just becoming the person that you are meant to be?
Wow. For me at this point in the process, the thing that I am wrestling out is like deconstruction is basically pulling apart what don't you believe anymore, what aren't you like holding to be truth anymore, right? Where did this come from? Is this even valid? Like it's that whole thing. It's the thing though is like, what does it lead you to? It doesn't lead you anywhere. It just like undoes stuff, right? And then you naturally from that process conclude other things and like go other places. And I was talking to a friend the other day and he was mentioning how it's yesterday. He was mentioning how it's human nature to gather around myths and stories. Like we're always going to do it no matter what it is. Like we're always going to do that. So whether it's religion or politics or whatever, right? Sports, like people will gather around these narratives and these characters and whatever. Like that will happen. So if we get rid of religion, it's not going to solve the problem necessarily. It'll address certain symptoms, but we will still be gathering on other things. So it's like, can we be more conscious and intentional about what we gather around? What kind of myths and like stories we are elevating and relating to? So for me, a big question I'm having to ask that I don't have answers for right now is like, yeah, okay, what am I personally, but then what am I inviting people to gather around? What am I gathering on with others? I don't have that right now because it used to be Jesus, right? And now I'm like, I don't actually, and it's okay. Like Jesus can still be that, but the bigotry and the like supremacy and colonial like reach that people have like co-opted Jesus's life for, like I can't be part of that. I don't think that's ever at all anything Jesus stood for. I think it's literally the opposite of what Jesus was after. This is terrible, right? It's so backwards. I can't be part of that. I don't need to throw Jesus away, but the people who are doing this have so sunk their teeth into Jesus that I'm like, how do we not send that same wrong message to people who are running the opposite direction from this? Like I need to. So I don't have the answer right now, but I'm like, yeah, what myths, what stories, what narratives can we gather around and be purposeful and intentional about that and like move forward from here and still value faith, still value belief in the divine and our spiritual like nature and I would dare I even say the supernatural experiences some of us have had. What do you do with that? And is it all just chemicals and neurons, or is there actually something else going on here? And at this point in my process, I'm like, I think it's more than that. I think that those other components of science and psychology, whatever, I think they're relevant, they have their place and they matter, but I don't think that's actually the source of this. So what does that look like? I don't know right now, but I'm currently in that space of like evaluating my own story and what am I inviting people into and where are we going with this? And I'd like to be constructive. I don't want to just keep calling all the homophobia out. I will keep doing that for the rest of my life probably, but I want to do more than that, What?
I love doing it.
Sure. There's like parts of it is fun, right? Parts of it's horrible and exhausting, but I want to do more than that. I'm not going to not do it because like the queer kids who are still closeted need us to be doing that. So we're going to do it. Right. But like, where are we going and what are we inviting people into? And can this be beyond this sexual, gender, race, class?
Conditions.
Yeah. Can we get past that? All of us together. And if so, where are we going with this? Right. Like I want to get better language and like vision myself for what that looks like. And I don't have great answers right now. But that's a big part of what I'm learning. And I think the unbecoming aspect of my journey, like it's
well,
that.
I love how your response to that question is 9 million questions. I love that. You're living the questions. That is an explorer. It's not having the answers, right? It's curiosity. It's radical curiosity. You mentioned that you want to get past that, those conditions, those boxes. There's one person listening to this podcast right now who is scared, who is in the closet, who is also afraid of losing everything they have. So can you help that one person right now with your words that's connecting with you to move out of their own box of fear? What would you say to that one person?
Totally. I would say to that person, thanks for asking that, Eric. I would say to that person, yes, you are going to lose those things. There's not really a scenario that's honest and authentic where you're going to keep all the things you had that you're afraid of losing and get to be your authentic self at the same time. A big part of like the world you built and the identity and persona you adopted was based on a lie, based on a half-life, if you will, right? You're going to lose those things. But here's the deal. What I would say to the consolation that I did not know until I actually did this. On the other side, I realized you are currently, as you're in the closet, holding on to things you're attached to, you are currently losing things. You are currently suffering cost right now. And you don't, the difference here is just you simply don't know what you're sacrificing and giving up by clinging to the certainty of what you currently enjoy as normal in your closeted life. The problem is what you are enjoying right now, you can't even fully enjoy it because you're not fully yourself. So here's the deal. Whatever you do, get to stop losing on the other side of this, whatever you get to genuinely step into and embrace and experience now, you'll be getting to do that as a full person. And so all the joy on the other side of coming out, if you will, is a whole different level of fulfillment and joy in life. And that's, I mean, no one could have told me that. I had to experience it for myself, but I can tell you from personal experience on the other side of coming out, there has been such an alignment and an embodiment and a fullness, like I would say a wholeness to my experience of being me that is irreplaceable. It was expensive to get here and it has been costly and painful for sure. However, it was worth it and I would do it again because when you touch what it's like to be a whole person, you can't go back to being part of a person again and try to make that feel okay. It's not.
Yeah.
I would say that.
Once you leap, you cannot unleap. You have no idea how thrilling and scary and worth it feels to have that. I'm trying to go off of this metaphor of leaping. The rush feeling and the feeling of the wind in your hair. And it's beautiful and it's scary and it's limitless.
You know, Eric, I saw a comment on my TikTok today. Someone was like, I don't think we're going to be coming out anymore. I think it's more of an experience of letting people in. And if you don't feel safe to let them in, that's their loss, but we're not coming out. We're letting people in. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about that. It's making me check my terminology. You know, I think I'm still going to keep saying come out because of what it means, but yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Once the scales tip, right? In the numbers of, the percentage of people who are out are bigger and bigger. And that's just making it, I don't want to say easier for people to come out, but it's normalizing it. So I love the idea of that world. Yeah. And we're kind of helping people to do that, Mike.
I hope so.
Go us. Yeah. Mike, such a pleasure. I love you so much. Thank you for doing this. How can people reach you if they want to talk to you?
My website, MikeMaeshiro.com is a great place to check out what I've got going on. I'm pretty active on Instagram. So again, it's going to be at Mike Maeshiro. I'm somewhat active on TikTok, so it's going to be at Mike Maeshiro. I also have a podcast / YouTube channel. That's going to be Mike Maeshiro or Confessions of a Reformer. So those are ways you can get a hold of me. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, y'all, I love you. Thank you for being here. And Mike, it's always a pleasure. We'll have you back.
Likewise, Eric. Thanks for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
Bye, guys.
Bye.